So in today's lesson, we are going to go through the 16 main types of reverb and effects. Let's start with the word reverb. You know, the word reverb is actually a shortened form of the word reverberation. So reverberation is not really the word that we use every day in the studio. We tend to refer to it as reverb. Now, what is reverb? Reverb is the sound that a room makes when it reflects the sound that you make back at you. So you can just imagine if you've ever been in a school hall or a cathedral or some large room. If you clap your hand or if you sing and you make a sharp sound, when you stop, you carry on hearing the sound echoing around the room. And it tends to have a sustain and then a decay and then it trails off. So usually the larger the room and the more reflective the surface of the room, maybe it's concrete or made out of hardwood, the longer the reverb will be. So you can just imagine when they first started recording music, they would record in halls or big rooms or live rooms, and whatever the natural acoustics of that room was, that was what was recorded in their recording. It's a pleasant sound. It's a sound that's natural. It's a sound that we're used to, and it can add a natural feeling to it. That's what reverb is. Now, going back to the origins of reverb, how would they have actually recorded reverb in the original days, 50, 60, 70 years ago? As I said, if they recorded, rock around the clock on one of those old tracks, they recorded them in big live rooms that actually had reflective walls and stuff. And that reverb you're hearing in those recordings are the natural reverb of the room. But what started to happen as recording started progressing, getting a little bit more sophisticated, guys started trying to record more dead. The thinking is, the more dead you record, the more power you have because you can add reverb afterwards. So how did they add reverb afterwards? Now, originally, the very first kind of reverb that guys created, and this is the real brute force method, was something called echo rooms. They would take a recording, record it relatively dry. Now, when I say the word dry, let me remind you that dry in the music business or in recording refers to something that is dead. It has no reflection, no reverb, no echo. We call that dry. And when we say wet, we're referring to something with lots of reverb on. Now, that's the term we use in the studio. How did they take a dry recording and add reverb? What they would do is they would have rooms, live recording rooms surrounding the control room, and they would feed the recording through a speaker into that room, and then they'd have a microphone on the other side of the room that would pick up the acoustics of that room. Then they would take that recording, that microphone recording of that room, and they'd feed it back into the mixing desk and mix the echo room with the dry live recording. And then they could control how much reverb. They could also control what kind of reverb. So you can imagine different kinds of echo rooms. One would be covered in wood paneling. Another would be covered in concrete. Some of the guys used to get creative and take huge concrete pipes and metal and all kinds of stuff to try and get reverb sounds. And that was the old school, hardcore, brute force method. Now, it's a very impractical way of doing it. It's a very effective way, but it's very impractical. Who has the space to build echo rooms, and who has the time, and who has the money? Because it costs a lot of money to build all these echo rooms. So that's the old school sort of brute force way. Having said that, that doesn't mean that guys don't still use this technique. And in fact, there's a story about a famous producer, Matt Lange. He's actually a fellow South African, and he is a very successful music producer who's worked with AC/DC, and he's worked with Def Leppard. And Def Leppard are one of the biggest selling artists in history. I think in the top 10 selling albums of all time, Def Leppard have an album there. And in fact, I heard a story about Matt Lange. What he did was he took the drum recordings, which were totally live, recorded on multi-track tape, and he found some cathedral in Germany, and he played those dry takes through massive speakers in these cathedrals, and he then recorded the reverb of that cathedral. He took the reverb recording now from that cathedral, took it back to Los Angeles where his studio was, and he mixed the reverb cathedral effect, mixed it in with the dry live recordings that he had of Def Leppard, and got this astronomical massive sound from using live. Now that's basically the same thing. It's the same technique as the Echo Room, except it wasn't done on site. It was something he did off site. Literally flew all his gear and everything to Germany, to some, old cathedral. They had this amazing acoustics. Now, if that was the old school brute force method, what started to happen is guys started saying, how can I get reverb but do it in a cheaper way, a more easier way? The next kind of reverb that I'm going to talk about is called a plate reverb. So I don't know if you've ever noticed that if you go next to a huge piece of metal and you make a sound, sometimes metal can vibrate and create a kind of a reverb, something similar to reverb. And this was something that they discovered in the 50s. They found that if you made a sound next to a large, thin piece of metal, it would resonate and reverberate. Now, it creates a reverb that is similar to a room reverb, similar to an echo room. It's not exactly the same, but it has the similar characteristics. It kind of creates this echoey, sustained and declining, ever declining velocity as it goes down, and it creates that decay. This was the next step in the evolution of reverb. So what started to happen is guys started to make these metal plates, and they were quite big, a couple of meters by a couple of meters. And what they would do is the same, just like the echo room, they take a dry recording. As I said, dry means with no reverb, and they would feed that recording and feed it into the metal plate, and then they'd have a microphone on the other side of the metal plate recording that reverb effect of the metal plate, and then they would feed that, mix it back with the dry through the mixing desk back in the control room, and that's the poor man's echo room. As I said, they were made out of metal, but they were still pretty, hard to make and to get them to resonate properly and to sound good. These were made by artisans. And that's what brought the next kind of reverb, and that is called a spring reverb. So spring reverb is even smaller and it's even cheaper than a metal plate. And a spring reverb was basically a box with a metal coil inside, and they would feed the sound into the metal coil, and then they'd have a receiver on the other side that would record. And the coil would kind of vibrate and create a similar type of sound to a reverb. Now, like I said, a room has a sound, a plate has a slightly different sound, and a spring has its own sound. Now, we don't really use spring reverbs today. People don't actually make them anymore. In fact, the only place you can find spring reverbs these days are in guitar amps. And the same with metal plate reverbs. I don't know of anyone that makes these anymore, but you can still get software versions of these. You can get virtual vintage plate and spring reverbs, and you can apply these sounds to your music to this day. In fact, most of the digital audio workstations have built-in plate and spring reverb presets that you can apply to your music, and we do still use these effects today. We might not have the physical plate or the physical spring, but we use the virtual software-based ones because there is a time and a place for using these. These are different flavors. See it like that. This is a different kind of flavor of reverb and another kind of flavor of reverb. So the next kind of reverb is called digital. Let's start at the beginning. Echo rooms, this is at the dawn of recording. Plate and spring is kind of around the 50s and the 60s. And then digital reverbs started to come in around late 70s, 80s, and the 90s. And this is where famous brands like Alesis and Lexicon came into the scene, and they had 19-inch electronic rack mount reverb units. And this is where reverb starts to get a little bit more complicated, complex, and having a little bit more control, because these reverbs, spring, plate, and echo, you really had no control. All you had, like in an echo room, was where you put the speaker and where you put the mic. That's all the control you had. A plate, you had no control. Basically, you fed the sound into the plate and you recorded with a microphone. And the same with the spring. But now with these digital reverbs, like I said, Lexicon and Alesis, I'll write that. what started to happen was we started to get a lot more sophisticated control of the reverb. So these 19-inch rack mount electronic units, we could control the EQ, we could control the sustain, the decay, we could control the flavor of the reverb. And what started to happen was a certain rack mount units started to have a cult following, and people started to idolize and worship certain models and certain sounds of reverb. And again, even though today we don't really use outboard electronic reverb units anymore like we used to in the 90s and the 80s, we can still get these reverb effects as software plugins now, as inserts in your digital audio workstation. So again, these were not perfect reverbs. They didn't sound exactly like a hall or exactly like a room or exactly like a bathroom or whatever, but they gave us great results. And also a lot more power and control, things like pre-delay and EQ and decay and things like that. And that brings us now to the final kind of reverb, and that is what's called a convolution reverb. Now, convolution reverbs are software-based reverbs, and they work off complex formulas. And the most amazing thing about convolution reverbs is they sound almost identical to the real thing. So you can just imagine how a plate didn't sound exactly like a room, and a spring reverb didn't sound like a room, and even these digital ones were getting closer. They didn't sound exactly like halls, but they sounded close. Convolution reverbs are identical to the rooms and the environments that we're trying to emulate. And how they work is a convolution reverb can actually create what's called a signature of a room, and then you can apply that signature to any sound you want. And what's actually happened these days is now people are going around all over the world to famous cathedrals and halls, rooms, famous live recording studios like Abbey Road and famous studios all over the world, and they're capturing the sound of halls and theaters and auditoriums, and then they're uploading those signatures to the internet, and you can download those signatures, you can apply that hall. So now, for example, if Matlanga wanted to record a new Def Leppard album, or you wanted to try and emulate one of those famous Def Leppard songs, you could actually go and download a famous hall from Germany, famous cathedral, and you could apply that convolution signature to your track. Okay, signature algorithm. So basically it creates a signature algorithm out of whatever environment. And this is like unbelievably powerful because there is no environment in the world that convolution reverb can't create. So it's the most natural, real sounding reverb that we have today. And not only can convolution emulate real spaces, you can also get plate and spring and digital reverbs that convolution technology has emulated. So this is the latest, and this is what all the top flagship reverb software-based inserts are using, that technology. And that's where we come to today. This is from 2005, say, onwards, we started to use a lot of these. So that brings us to the end of reverbs. These are the 5 main types of reverbs. If you enjoyed that lesson and you'd like to take your music mixing and mastering to that top 10 level, then we would love to help you over at advancedmusicproduction.com. Click the link to learn more about our AMP membership and our private coaching programs.